You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
I sat down at the home computer one day because he had forgotten to log off. He had a secret email, private personal email account that I had no idea about.
In that moment, what did you feel?
Oh, devastated. Absolutely devastated.
Angry?
Angry, distressed, upset, horrified.
I'm Mia Friedman, and this is No Filter. Affairs are a little like childbirth. Someone is always having one somewhere, usually right under the nose of a spouse, because nobody knows everything that happens inside a marriage, not even the people in it. That's how journalist Kate Legge begins her book, Infidelity and Other Affairs. And in it, she notes that conservative estimates suggest infidelity happens in 20 to 25% of all marriages. And that's conservative estimates. But the thing is, what do those relationships look like before someone cheats? And what happens afterwards? Is it ever possible to put the pieces of a broken heart back together after treachery? Can you forgive that kind of betrayal and move on together? Before Kate discovered her husband of many decades was cheating on her, had been cheating on her, in fact, since the very start of their marriage, she thought their relationship was great. Not perfect, but certainly solid and happy. They had kids, they had a life. So why? Why does someone decide to betray the person they promised to love? Being an investigative journalist, Kate wanted answers about what causes infidelity, so she began to research it. There's no single answer, of course, but in her book, Kate lists some of them. There's drought in the marital bedroom, impulsiveness, insecure attachment, loneliness, neuroticism, narcissism, discontent, substance abuse, a desire for risk-taking, a quest for self-discovery, or just an escape from the monotony of monogamy. So why did her husband do it? And how much did Kate really want to know about his affairs? The result is in her new book, and it uncovers some startling truths about her pretty high-profile husband and her son. This is one of the most brutally honest and fascinating conversations I have ever had on this podcast. Here's Kate Legge. I know it's probably hard to look back on your marriage with the wisdom that you had by the end of it. But if before you found out about the infidelity, I'd have asked you what was the happiest time in your marriage, what would you have said?
Well, probably our time in Washington, D.C., where we lived for 5 years, where we had our children. And paradoxically, even though we were in the middle of a crack war and we had bars on every window and there was a sign at the local laundromat asking patrons to remove their bullets before they put their jeans in the machine, we sort of grew in ash. And that was probably our happiest time. You know, we were overseas, we were both journalists, we were just soaking up the Clinton campaign for the presidency. We were through the Bush presidency and we were living in this danger zone where we had a really close friendship with lots of neighbours. And that was probably, I think, the happiest time in our marriage. You know, we were away from Australia, away from family and friends, which made it harder. But then we were discovering this brave new world and doing it together.
How old were you both when you met?
I met my husband in Canberra in the press gallery just after the Hawke government had been elected. And the whole place was running amok with affairs. You know, there were affairs in the press gallery, there were affairs in the ministry, there were affairs in the parliamentary chamber, under every desk, behind every door, even up in the prime ministerial suite. But nobody paid any attention to that then. It was just sort of, that was what happened. Very different to, you know, the Me Too movement and what we've seen coming out of Parliament House in the last 2 years.
You mentioned Bob Hawke. He was infamously a philanderer. I can't believe I used that word, but, you know, his affair with Blanche D'Alpuget while he was married to Hazel Hawke and others were the stuff of legend, but at the time it was never reported on.
It was never reported on, and that, I think, globally it wasn't reported on. I mean, I remember when we went to Washington and Gary Hart, who was a Democratic candidate, was caught photographed on a boat called, believe it or not, Monkey Business, with a pretty girl on his knee. And it was the first time, and it became a character issue, of course, as it does in the United States.
Yeah.
But in Canberra, because everyone was concentrating on this massive agenda for economic reform, and it would have been considered beneath us, really, there were those standards. You just didn't delve into people's private lives. And so that was just an unwritten rule that everybody observed and followed, even though we were fascinated by what was happening behind the scenes.
When you and your future husband got together, was it in the context of an affair for either of you?
No, not at all. No,
So you were
we
both
just
single?
No, sorry, that's not true. I was with somebody else in Melbourne, but we didn't consummate the relationship. That's how much of a prude I am, until I had disconnected from my previous boyfriend.
I see.
So we had this night where we met at the National Press Club, and then we came home to his house and we talked all night, but we didn't go to bed together.
There was something there and you wanted to have a clean break with the past before.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's just part of my nature. And just going back before to your discussion of Bob Hawke, I mean, that was an amazing affair, wasn't it? And if you look at some affairs like Charles and Camilla, Bob and Blanche, they were never going to fade away. They were always going to end up together. But no.
I interviewed Blanche before Bob died, but near the end of his life, when she wrote her book about their affair,
Longing.
essentially, on Longing. And I felt the same way you did, that it was a really big love. People, even then, all those years later, were very angry with her after that interview came out and were like, it was quite visceral and not at Bob but at her for what did she do to our Hazel. That was very much the sense, wasn't it?
That's right, because everybody loved Hazel and she really endeared herself to us. She was a great leveller. All the things she dealt with, the drug addiction of her daughter, the loss of a child, and also dementia in the end. I mean, she was our friend and we knew her and we took her to heart, and so it did. We've always side-eyed Blanche, I think, as the other younger woman who wouldn't let go. But, you know, people, sometimes they can't let go. And this is one of the things I guess I've understood as I've looked into it more and got beyond the hurt. You know, there's a beautiful quote from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream where he writes, "Lovers and madmen have such fevered brains, such shaping fantasies. They apprehend what more than cool reason can ever comprehend." And that's what happens in affairs. And people don't look over their shoulder and they're not looking at the consequences or the casualties of what happens. But I understand that now much more, even though I would never transgress in that way because as I said, I'm very prudish and prudent. And also I'm very concerned. I know the consequences, having been a journalist and written and toured other people's lives and stories for 30 or 40 years, you really understand the damage that can be done. And so I probably wouldn't set foot there, which is sort of a lesser, it makes me feel dull and decent and not, you know, purple and daring and love and lose all.
When you got together, you were both journalists.
Yep.
You were in Washington. Was there a point in your relationship as equals where his career started to take precedent and yours took more of a back seat?
Definitely.
When was that, do you think?
Well, from the very start in Washington, because I had the two children and I was, you know, pretty housebound. So I really had to develop a different style of journalism, which was less investigative in news reporting and more writing about everything that was happening around me, which was a very rich environment to write about. So I pursued that when I came home, and my husband began to be promoted up the executive tree, and I was offered an editorship of the Sydney Morning Herald, but I turned it down because I wanted to be a present mother as much as I could, and it was just a sacrifice that women in that era still had to make. I said to someone the other day, I remember coming back from Washington and seeing a man behind a stroller and having a double take because it was just so unusual. That was in 1991, 92. Very unusual for men to be seen with children, taking them to daycare or picking them up from school. So it seems like we're so recent, and yet it was over 30 years ago and things were very different. And so I made that decision. And did I resent it? Not really, because I loved writing. That was always, you know, where I wanted to go. I always wanted to write a novel and be a novelist and a longer writer than journalism affords. And so I was happy with my compromise. although there were times when I thought that I had perhaps, sabotaged where I could have gone with my journalism.
Was that ever a bone of contention between you and your husband? Or that was more a conflict in yourself?
It was a conflict in myself, really, because he has always been a really big supporter of me and my work, and he never tried to squash me or stifle my ambitions in any way. So, as you're right, it's a conflict that I sort of fought, a battle I waged on the frontier of myself. I don't regret that now. I mean, I'm very accepting of all the decisions and mistakes I've made. That's one of the wonderful things about growing old. There's no point, in worrying about things that you can't change, and you just have to accept them.
I want to ask you about sex, and I want to ask you about sex in a long-term relationship. Tell me about the More Roots Club.
Well, that was a couple of us who used to meet at the local park, and the husbands were always complaining that they didn't have enough sex. I mean, it's a very common refrain in marriages, and particularly when you've got young children and you're tired, you're working really hard. It's a tough gig to feel like, slamming up against the bedroom door.
Or the floor, as you said.
That's right.
Instead of a soft mattress.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so this arose earlier in our marriage in Washington. We read this article in the Washington Post which talked about couples just making a date once a week, and nothing would get in the way of that. And it was something that we did try to do.
So not just date night, but sex night.
Sex night, basically, yeah. And recognising that it was a problem, scheduling it. And so let's just, make sure that that's taken care of at least. So, we did.
How'd that go?
Well, not very well, obviously, in the long run. But it worked for a while. Libido, people have different libidos. Yeah. This is the other thing. And when you both meet, of course, you've got the sort of lust hot button of passion happening. And so you don't really think about that longer term, the familiarity and the proximity. I mean, there is a bit of a monotony that monogamy, can tap into. And I think it was Esther Perel who wrote about the impact that affairs can have on lifting that sexuality. And she says the eroticized gaze of the third has a habit of challenging the domesticated perceptions of each other. And you do, you become routine. They're around all the time. They're using the bathroom. They're, picking their nose. They're all those things that couples do that turn each other off and perhaps lessen that desire. But I think that we did have very different libidos. I do, because I have since repartnered with somebody else who's got a pretty low libido. So
we'll get to that. I want to hear more about that.
And if there's drought in the marital bedroom too, I think that's a real problem for a couple. I think that is certainly the ingredient that will definitely lead to an affair. If someone's going hungry and they're thirsty, they're going to step outside the marital bedroom for sure.
So unless it's mutually agreed and people have the same appetite, I guess, ultimately if there's a big difference, a big gap in libido, problems in store.
I think so. That's what I do. I really do.
When he sort of talked about he wanted more sex and you tried, and at one point he ended up in hospital.
With a dislocated shoulder.
Kate, that's very impressive.
Yes, can
you talk me through that, please?
No. Other than it happened and it was very embarrassing, and I think he had to wear a sling for a while but had to make up some excuse at work as to why it had happened. I always felt pretty proud of myself actually, being a rather dull, decent and prudish person.
Very impressive.
But it's never happened again. There was, of course, sex, but there just was never enough of it, I think, to satisfy a pretty healthy appetite.
You made a friend when you were living in Melbourne. Her name was the Countess. How did you guys become friends?
Through the children. It's always the way. I've always made friends on the sidelines of sporting events or school events or at the school gate. It was
you
one of those
say the great thing about children is that they bring home strangers who have parents.
Yes.
I love that, because one of my best friends was made for me when my son made a friend at kindy. Yeah.
Well, the bonding and the attachment that you have and the sharing of mistakes you've made and, problems handling children and the career versus, mother, that divide. And so there's so much that you talk about. And I really loved her. She was just a gorgeous girl. Very vivacious and enthusiastic, and we fell in pretty close pretty quickly.
And were you couple friends?
Yes, we were part of a group actually. There were 3 couples. We had birthdays together. We went out for dinner together. We went to, cultural events together. Yeah, we were pretty close.
Did you talk about your relationships? Was that where the sort of the More Roots Club came up?
No, that wasn't the More Roots Club, but we certainly kvetched about our husbands a lot, as you do with someone who's a confidant, and I mean, goodness knows I had no idea that it might have been being passed on down the line. Yeah. But would I have said anything different? No. I mean, they're the sort of normal irritations that you have in a relationship, in a marriage. And she had plenty too. So we just shared them as we talked and walked, and we often holidayed together too, just us and the kids. And there'd always be those sort of conversations about husbands and desires and ambitions and children.
Tell me about the day that you found out about your husband's infidelity.
We'd been at a party for the other couple in that group of 6. There were 3 couples, and it was a big birthday milestone for her. And I had shopped for her gift with the Countess. We got there early and she took a while to arrive, which I remember thinking was sort of odd. But there was nothing, she gave no hint that there'd been any trouble, which there had been apparently before they'd arrived, because her husband had discovered her phone bill and had gone through and put 2 and 2 together. And so nothing was said at the party, and we got home and I was busy getting the kids ready for school the next day, supervising homework, and my husband called me out to the garage and in the dun hue of dusk, and in amongst the paint cans and the hard rubbish he dumped his own pile.
How did he look when you walked into the garage, and did you have any clue what you were about to hear?
I had no idea. I was totally blindsided, which says something about the failure of my antenna, I guess, but I just didn't see it coming. I really didn't. I had no idea, and also not her. That was just really staggered me. And I felt this sort of double betrayal. That was the hardest thing for me. And it's weird that one should be so angry with the woman rather than the man. But I felt that my husband had grievances in our relationship, which justified, in a sense, the actions he took. And I felt I'd never wronged her. And it was so hurtful. I can't tell you how hurtful it was when you trust people and they've lied to you. You have this twice, and you have this feeling of just being worthless, utterly worthless, that no one could spare a thought for how you might react to all of that. So it was very hurtful. And what did I do? I got into the car and drove around the neighbourhood, bawling my eyes out. But I just didn't know where to go with my aching heart and shrieking lungs. So I went back home and decided to hold on to it very tight and not make a scene about it and not tell anybody about it, because our son was going into year 12. And I really didn't want to sabotage his prospects with this massive drama at home. So we just kept it tight, and all sorts of promises were made, and we tried to persevere and find a way forward. And we did for a number of years. And then I heard that she had left her husband, and I told my husband, because I always overshare everything. No filter could be my second name.
Yes, welcome, sister.
I know. And then I sat down at the home computer one day because he had forgotten to log off he had a secret email, private personal email account that I had no idea about. And that's when I realised that it might have stopped for a while, but it certainly continued. But there were also emails to another woman. So it wasn't just the one. And the only thing I did that was slightly revengeful was to send the Countess the emails that had been sent to the other woman, because I think she thought she was the queen bee, but a man who's deceiving his wife is certainly capable of also deceiving his mistress.
That's a lot, Kate. That's all a lot. When he first told you in the garage, how did he frame it?
Well, as something that had happened 2 or 3 times, not as a serious affair. So it diminished its closeness and intensity to spare me, which I probably, at the time was probably better for me than knowing the whole.
What was the truth?
The whole truth. Well, the whole truth was that it had been a very intense affair, and it hadn't just been 3 times. I mean, more and more details, of course, came out.
How long had it gone on for?
A couple of years, I think.
Oh,
I think a year at least. Yeah.
And how did you unpack how you felt about her and how you felt about him? It's because it's like you lost 2 people at once. So how did you even start to unscramble that egg?
Well, I had no more contact with her. Obviously, that
Did
was
you
a
ever
way
call her or confront her? Never spoken to her again?
Never spoken to her again, no. I've had a letter from her that I'd shredded because
Did
it
you
was
read
like
it
a thank you
first?
for it. Yes. It was just a very short note. It was almost like she was apologising for not turning up to a dinner party.
Oh.
So I just shredded that. And look, I've forgiven her completely as I've come to terms because these events were 17 years ago.
But I want to go back to then. So I tend to have arguments with people in the shower in my head where I say all the things that I need to say. You're a writer, Kate. How did you not want to write to her and make her understand the depths of your betrayal and your grief and anger at what she'd done?
Well, I think the emotions were so raw and so painful in a way it was hard to put it into words. It's almost like sometimes you need that distance and the time, the shift in time and the shift in perspective, and it tempers the emotions that you feel and you're better able to express yourself. I did start to write a record for my own purposes, but I didn't publish it at the time. So that was just, I was able to pour out my emotions onto the page, completely unfettered, but, knowing that they wouldn't be published, certainly not then. I did think about doing it. I did think about writing a book. That was my first response because that's a writer's first reflex. But my literary agent at the time said it was a really bad idea. And so I didn't. I took her advice and
you wanted to write from a scar, not a wound, which is what you've done all these years later. I imagine the other couple in your group found out.
They found out, yeah. I don't think they knew.
Found out,
yes.
when it all came to light. Did you speak to the Countess's husband?
Yes, and I still speak to him, actually. It's sort of quite strange. He rings often. In fact, I just spoke to him a couple of days ago and Did
you two ever think of having revenge sex
with
each other?
Never.
Just thought I'd throw that in there.
Never.
You still could. No, you've got a partner. You can't. But maybe he does
That's
too.
right.
Okay.
But no, and I still have a visceral reaction when I see his number come up on the phone because I think, oh no.
Yeah.
Because he always had the dirt and there'd always be some new revelation every time he rang.
You two became partners in crime is the opposite of what you were,
right.
but partners in victimhood in a way. But did you share intelligence?
We sleuthed, we shared intelligence.
Was there a lot of adrenaline?
Oh gosh, yes. When all this was going on, oh my goodness. It was just coursing through your body all the time. I mean, they're not good for well-being or mental health in any way, affairs, once they're exposed. So it was, for a long time. I smoked too much. I drank too much. I had suicidal thoughts at times. It was a very unhealthy period. And I think it was unhealthy for my husband too because he was absolutely racked with self-loathing and guilt. And, to this day, he still does. And the publishing of the book has made him go over it all again. And he does. He said to me the other day.
Him, Kate. It's hard for him.
It's hard for him.
I'm joking. Kate?
No, but it is hard. It is hard to live with that.
Are you the Dalai Lama?
I know how much he's done to try and atone for what he did to us as a family. It hasn't been easy for him accepting that, and he still, shudders at the thought of what he did. And I think he's still trying to unpick it, and so he doesn't like to be reminded of it. Look, writing and broadcasting, and we're in this business to make sense of our lives and to share what's happened to us, I think, to help other people understand these things when they're going through them. I mean, that's always been...
It's very generous, but I agree with you. It's like they say someone out there has a wound in the shape of your words. After the break, Kate explains exactly what she found when researching her husband's family history that explained his infidelity. Stay with us. When did you find out that it wasn't just the Countess?
Well, when we decided to have another go and try and work this thing out, I asked for a complete, due discovery, and I wanted to know just so I wouldn't find any more bodies. That's what I said to him. And he did, and he took it very seriously.
Can you set the scene? Was this a conversation? Was it a series of conversations?
It was a series of conversations. And then before we had a naughty weekend away at Dalesford, the start of trying to get things back on track. And before that, I would meet him there. I said he had to come clean with everything that had happened for the last 30 years so that I wouldn't stumble over another case, somebody else telling me something that I hadn't known. So it would all be out in the open.
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure. And Esther Perel says this is not a good idea. Because
coming clean, she says it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, terrible idea because, of course, it poisons the chance for you to reconcile because, you've got all this stuff, new information that still hasn't been processed. But I didn't find that. I found it a great relief because I could see it wasn't just about me. It wasn't my fault necessarily. It was a pattern of behaviour over a period of time. And even though it had been happening since we were together.
When did it start?
Well, I think there were a couple of flings when he went to Washington before I got there. And I think there were a couple of flings there. So, obviously just unable to restrain himself, of sort of the person he is, I think. And I mean, if you look at people like Bob Hawke, Bill Clinton, I'm not putting my husband up on a pedestal, but I mean, they are men of a certain type, very flirtatious, very socially gregarious, very ambitious. They're also fascinated by policy and reform and all these serious subjects, but there's a side of them which makes them hard dogs to keep on the porch. And I think that, some of the research I did when writing this book has given me an understanding of the fact that not only is it possibly behaviour that's modelled at home, but that it may also have some genetic predisposition to make people take the risk of having affairs.
Which is what you discovered. When did you decide that you were going to look into his background and infidelity within his family?
Well, the theme of infidelity. I always knew that there was a story that his grandmother had an affair, but I didn't know very much about it. His father had left and divorced his mother over a long-standing affair, and our wedding was tricky because they would both be there and my husband's mother hadn't really met the other woman before. So I knew that, but it didn't worry me because I just thought that was their bad relationships and that wasn't going to happen to me and it would never visit me. And I was very optimistic about the marriage. And it was only when our son had an affair that broke up his engagement that I thought, hang on a sec, there's a story here about the fact that it has gone past like a baton from one generation to the next. And is there a pattern? Or is it just a singular spiral of passion between two people freed from the hair shirt of compromise? So I found this...
Speak to that again. Two people?
Well, two people freed, in a singular spiral of passion freed from the hair shirt of compromise, of vows, of marriage. They just give rectitude the flick. Is that what happened, or is it because they saw infidelity in their family of origin and it presented an exit strategy for them if their own marriage wasn't going so well? Because in each case, my husband's father was furious at what he believed to be his mother's affair. And similarly, our son was furious.
When did they find out, your boys?
After the marriage broke down.
Not until then.
Not until then, no.
I want to go back to the timeline a little bit because when you were having your naughty weekends in Dalesford and you were trying to rekindle the spark and you asked him to come clean and you learned that it had been happening since pretty much the beginning of your marriage, what made you think he could stop?
I'm just a sucker, I guess. I'm a believer in people and I give them a second chance, I guess.
But that's more than a second chance. You know that Maya Angelou thing, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. He'd shown you who he is with the stakes so high. Not just was he cheating on you from the beginning, but then with your best friend. I don't want to slander him too much personally, but when you looked at that, what made you think this is someone who cares about me or who respects me?
Because in every other way he had shown that loyalty and respect. And I lost my mother when I was 23 and I'd been with my husband for almost 30 years. So I knew him for longer than I knew my mother. And he was very important to my sense of who I was. And the family was very important to me. And that was really the crux of it. I didn't want to explode my family. I wanted to keep it together.
You talk about intimacy when you and your husband were going through this issue around sex and he wanted more of it and he tried to frame it as a lack of intimacy. And you said that made it sound a lot more noble than not getting enough roots. But then you questioned, but was that true about the intimacy? And you write, we lived inside each other's skin. We roamed each other's minds. We talked, we argued, we laughed, we sang, we danced. But we didn't share the insatiable physical attraction that often doesn't wait for the comfort of a mattress as it bangs up against the walls or the floor. Even though you once did, presumably at the start, that sounds like a long-term relationship. And the terms of that relationship still suited you, but it wasn't enough for him.
That's right. That is absolutely right.
But you still thought, after you decided we're going to give it a go, that he could be kept on the porch.
I thought so. I did. I had great hopes, and he was very persuasive and very convincing, and I felt that he had had a moment of scalding the soul, where he had looked at himself deep down and decided to change. But he couldn't, obviously. And you've got to remember, too, that I did feel loved, I did feel loved and I felt supported, and I may have been blind, deaf and dumb, but that's how he made me feel. I didn't have any cause really in the beginning to suspect that he didn't love me. I felt loved, and one of my bads, for example, he's a very romantic man. I was very aromantic. He loved celebrating anniversaries. He would always buy something. I would never remember them. So, he used to buy my clothes for me. He looked after me in lots of ways that made me feel very loved.
That sounds a bit controlling, we would say now.
Possibly. It was very convenient for me. I hate shopping, so I was always very grateful for that. And he's got a great eye, really great eye, and loves fashion and style and design. And it was something that really wasn't, one of my pet projects. So I was happy to let him do those sorts of things. So I did feel loved. I want to stress that.
Yeah.
Because he was very loving. But
So you're saying it wasn't, the idea that someone who cheats on you is abusive or emotionally abusive or
controlling
or horrible to you. That wasn't that. So there was a lot in this for you.
There was a lot in this.
You weren't just being a victim.
No.
And a naive person. This was good.
This was a good relationship, and we always talked. We've always been great talkers, so that there's no walls in our household, apart from the fact there was this massive one that I didn't see. As Saul Bellow wrote, when you lose a partner, it's like driving through a plate glass window that you didn't know was there at the time, but then you spend years picking the shards of glass out of your hair. So it was a little bit like that for me in the discovery. I was just completely blindsided, and then, of course, you begin questioning and looking at all of the things that you have to reconcile, and the past is no longer what you thought you knew.
Yes,
something completely different.
When we first started talking, sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right.
When we first started talking, the way you were talking about Washington, your eyes were lighting up. And then now knowing that he was cheating through that time, it's like you can compartmentalize that and it doesn't cloud your view of the good parts of your marriage. It's almost like you've been able to tweezer those bits out. Is that true?
Yeah, get the splinters out, sort of. Yeah, because there is so much more there. And I think that's one of the things I took from Dan Savage, who's a US sex commentator who describes himself as gay, married and monogamish, because he says we promise not to stray, but sometimes we do. And if we do, at least be honest, but don't throw out everything that's good about the relationship. And it's so true, because there's so much often that can be held together, and there's a reason for staying together, but the reasons have to be strong enough to get you over the line. They certainly were for me, but my solution is not your solution. That's what I have to remember to keep saying to people, because every affair is different depending on the protagonists and the relationship and the hourglass they inhabit. Every affair is different.
Something that struck me after you found out, I just want to read a couple of things that you wrote. You said, the before and after scratches your eyelids. I got into the car and drove around the neighbourhood bereft, not knowing where to land with my stinking trouble. It was Sunday night. Families were having dinner, finishing homework, readying for tomorrow's start of the week. Nobody wanted a dishevelled banshee on their doorstep. After lapping our suburb, I went home with a plan to hold tight to this thing so that I might contain the after shudders. Our eldest was about to embark on his final year of school. I would not be party to sabotaging his prospects. First you staunch the bleeding, then you falter forward as though you've always got around with stumps where your legs used to be. It seems like you very much turned inwards in terms of the way you describe yourself as a dishevelled banshee and my stinking trouble. You seemed to very much take on the stench of his affair. And then in the aftermath, when you decided to try and repair it, you wrote, I determined to fix our marriage. I wanted to address his concerns. I wanted to be a sex goddess after all. Who knew? I resented the Countess's hold on my husband. After 25 years together, he was my kith and kin. I loosened my buckles. I got a Brazilian. Apparently the Countess had one. We had phone sex. I turned myself inside out trying to satisfy him. I bought lingerie instead of bonzundies from the supermarket. I wore makeup. A girlfriend taught me how. I had my brows threaded. This wasn't me, not me at all. I took his grievances seriously. I owned my mistakes. We sought counselling. He was practised at venting his spleen. The female psychologist warmed to his easy manner. He'd read more books on marriage and relationships than me. He tapped into her wavelength, laying his misdeeds beside the teetering pile of mine. Again, you tried to change yourself. That to me is quite heartbreaking when you hear that back. Do you feel sad for that person? That version of you?
No.
But you tried so hard.
I know, I tried so hard. The family was so important to me, and to try and to have the family together, it meant that we had to stick together. And that was so important to me. Well, I've never thought I was perfect. I think we're all hewn from crooked timber. And I felt that there was a log of claims that he had that were serious. I felt I hadn't nurtured our relationship enough. I was too busy trying, the marriage, then the children, and then the career, trying to, stitch together whatever I could, sort of patchwork of roles. And so I did feel that I hadn't nurtured the relationship enough, and that if we were going to succeed and to stay together, I had to make some changes, as well as expecting him to make changes. Now, of course,
well, that was of him to make changes.
Well, they weren't made in the end, so maybe it was a waste of time from my point of view. But I think also, and this is another thing about the affairs that Esther Perel writes about in Rethinking Infidelity, about it can pilot emotional growth. I mean, grief is no different from success. It can destroy you or enrich you. Those either road.
So you found this stuff that you described, getting the Brazilian and phone sex. You don't seem sad about that. It was almost like a little bit of an adventure.
It was a bit of an adventure. It was a bit of an adventure for me to do those things, which I would never normally have done. And there's a lovely book called Simple Passions by Annie Ernaux, where she talks about the affair from the lover's point of view. And she says that this affair brought her closer to the world. And it's sort of like, even though it's not pleasant at the time, even though it can be painful, there's something about being exposed to the richness of life, be it good or bad, that I always find stimulating and interesting. And, yes, I probably wouldn't have said that when I was weeping in my cups, but afterwards I can see I learned all sorts of things through that, and it did pilot an emotional growth in me and an understanding of relationships that I would never have.
And it seems like it also taught you who you weren't. Like, even as you were doing these things, you were like, it's not me. I'm not makeup and a Brazilian and lingerie. No. That's not me.
No.
So between finding out about the Countess and then the second time when you found out, what was that space of time? Like when you sat down and saw on the computer that he was...
that was incredibly shocking, because I had...
That second time.
I had got lulled into a sense of everything being okay, and we were fine, and we were on the road, and, everything was all right.
And were there years between those two?
About 3 years, yeah.
And then what was that confrontation like with your husband?
Again, he denied everything, and that was when I burgled the phone.
You had receipts, you had the emails.
I had the emails, I know, but he still denied it. And it was on paper. I hadn't actually walked in on the bedroom and found them, so it could have just been a fantasy,
there was
a bit of an imagination.
Plausible
deniability of a sort, but only for a couple of days. And then
Until
I burgled the phone, and that was just really horrendous, because I recognised then the dimensions of the deceit, and that's when I went berserk, as Helen Garner writes, when she found out that her husband was cheating on her, that electric moment of implosion where, grief scores us in different ways. But in my case, I just beat myself up. And I think I was
You literally beat myself
up rather than murder him. I know. And it was really quite shocking to see that bruise in the mirror of the restroom where I worked for writing about other people's conflicts and conundrums, that was really quite shocking for me to see the damage that I'd done. But it was also, weirdly, I was proud of this proof of this is what I was going through. I think I liken it in the book to those guests at the Israeli wedding who 1 minute they're dancing and the floor collapses and then they're just harrowing, blood-curdling screams. It's that you just don't see it coming and there is just a shock of recognition. So the suspicion, the hyper-suspicion that affairs kindle is really, I think, more poisonous and damaging often than the finding out because it goes on and on and on. I went from, head in the clouds, oblivion, to being hyper-vigilant to the point where it just preoccupied me. It colonised my mind. I just couldn't think of anything else, so that everything he told me had to be examined and tested and checked and verified. It was just, in the end, it was just a nightmare. And so I was so glad in a way to leave that behind. It's so liberating.
Because you had the proof.
I had the proof. And also, once we had separated finally, I didn't have to go back into that space again of worrying.
How soon after you found the proof did you separate?
You almost have to keep finding that they've lied again and again and again and again and again until you utterly degrade and disgrace yourself. And it's only really then that you can walk out. And so I didn't walk out. So I stayed for another 4 years. So I can see you're going to despair at me. But again, as I had to say, it was because of my commitment and loyalty to the family. And this was the only family I had. And
I have no right to judge. I'm not judging at all. It's more...
Well, it's an important lesson to learn, because one of the things I found is that you can't tell people what to do.
Not at all.
And I had lots of friends who said, leave, go, don't stand there for another minute, rip up this, do that.
Yeah.
But in a sense, what people need to do is to love you and support you and tell you that you've got to do what's best for you. Yeah. And that's the thing, gives you the agency then of making a decision that's not disappointing everybody else, because you really just got to think about you and your children and your well-being and if you want the relationship to survive or not. But it's got to be your decision. It can't be anyone else's.
It's rare to meet someone who has never been cheated on or cheated themselves. It's such a universal experience, but the shame that's associated with it on both sides means that it's so rarely discussed as openly and honestly as Kate does in her book and in the interview that you just heard. There's more to our conversation, which you can listen to right now if you're a Mamamia subscriber. And if you're not yet, you can become one in just a couple of clicks via the link in the show notes. I would be so thrilled if you showed your support in that way. It costs way less than buying a magazine each month or subscribing to a newspaper. Remember those? Anyway, in the subscriber episode, I asked Kate about the revenge affair and about how a mother deals with the absolute earthquake of her own son having an affair. And that was soon after her grandchild was born. Click the link in the show notes to listen right now. Our executive producer is Eliza Ratliff with sound production by Madeline Joannou. No Filter is produced by Emmeline Peterson along with me, Mia Friedman. Thanks for having me in your ears.